respect Resolution 1701. We support the role of UNIFIL, to which EU member states as significant contributors as a provider of stability. The EU fully supports the efforts of Special Envoy Grundberg in Yemen. The EU condemns the Houthi attacks on commercial and naval vessels in the Red Sea. We call for the immediate implementation of Resolution 2722, and to safeguard the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, we have launched the defensive maritime security operation UNAVFOR Aspides. The European Union remains gravely concerned about the situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, where settlement expansion and settler violence have reached record levels, and violent attacks by extremists on both sides are on the rise. Settlements are illegal under international law and constitute an obstacle to peace. Israel must stop settlement expansion and legalization, prevent settler violence, demolitions, evictions, and forced transfers, and ensure the perpetrators of crimes are held accountable. Ahead of Ramadan, Pesach, and Easter, the EU specifically underlines that the legal and historic status quo of the holy sites must be preserved in line with previous understandings and with respect to Jordan's role as custodian. We call on everyone to exercise restraint and lower tensions in order to ensure the safety of all and to refrain from provocation, actions, and rhetoric on the Temple Mount, Al-Haram al-Sharif. Finally, Mr. President, the EU reaffirms its commitment to a just and comprehensive resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on the two-state solution with the State of Israel and an independent, democratic, contiguous, sovereign, and viable State of Palestine, living side by side in peace and security and mutual recognition, and with Jerusalem serving as the future capital of both states. It is vital to restore a political horizon towards a two-state solution. The EU is ready to contribute to reviving a political process, including through the Peace Day effort, and welcomes diplomatic peace and security initiatives and supports the holding of an international peace conference under UN auspices. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, speaking on behalf of a group of friends.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has the honor to take the floor on behalf of the group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. Our member states, in spite of the circumstances that have compelled us to gather here today, appreciate the convening of this plenary meeting to debate a matter to which we all attach major importance, particularly in a time of continued deterioration of the situation on the ground. As such, this situation requires our collective attention and action. That action has once again regretfully been obstructed by the use of the veto in the Security Council by one of its permanent members. Mr. President, this situation is only a fraction of many decades of continued occupation and both systematic and brutal violence by the occupying power. However, now almost 5 months has passed since the beginning of this latest and regrettable spiral of violence, death, and destruction that has claimed the lives of thousands of innocent civilians, particularly women and children. These numbers include over 150 UN personnel, and we've seen the destruction of hundreds of homes in the Gaza Strip and of all components of civilian life. As if that weren't enough, we must also count the forcible displacement of more than 85% of the population. These have been 5 long and painful months in which the entire Palestinian civilian population in the Gaza Strip has been living in a genuine hell on earth, as described by the very Secretary General of the United Nations. This is a result of Israel's relentless bombardment of Gaza by air, land and sea, and as a result of the inhumane and crippling siege that has been imposed by Israel. The figures from this war are dramatic, to say the least. The death toll recently reached 30,000. This figure could be quickly surpassed if the occupying power were to make good on its threat of deploying a military operation in Rafah. This is perhaps, and perhaps it's needless to say, one of the deadliest and most destructive wars in history. However, in spite of the barbarism seen in the images and the abundance of information we have on this brutal war, that for the first time ever is being broadcast live by its very victims. In spite of that, the Security Council continues to fail to fulfill its mandate of maintaining international peace and security as provided for in the UN Charter. This fact is due to the lack of political will on the part of at least one of its permanent members, who has obstructed once again the minimal yet urgent demand of the entire world. That is the call for a ceasefire. In other words, the demand for the one thing that will halt the bloodshed, the only thing that will stop the forced displacement, and the only thing that will allow for the protection of the Palestinian civilian population, ensuring inter alia the entry of urgent aid, which is so necessary to alleviate the catastrophic humanitarian conditions, including widespread hunger, disease, and the lack of safe shelter. In that regard, we take this opportunity to commend the effort and leadership of Algeria, a member of our group, in championing the Palestinian cause within the Security Council. We commend them also for responsibly exercising their duties as a permanent member of that body by putting forward an action-oriented draft resolution. Its only goal was to call for nothing more than an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in full accordance with what humanity as a whole is demanding and even marching for in the streets of various capitals around the world, including in this very city last Saturday. What is being demanded is also in full accordance with the very provisions of Resolution A/ES 10/22, adopted overwhelmingly by this very General Assembly. Now, on the other hand, we must sincerely decry the veto cast on the 20th of February 2024 by a permanent member of the Security Council. And we must lament the excuses provided at that time and once again just a few minutes ago in this meeting. These have once again prevented that body from effectively fulfilling its mandate and prevented it from rising to this historic moment and to the expectations of the entire world. Consequently, today the Security Council continues to fall far short of the demands made by this General Assembly. As we all know, the General Assembly is the most representative organ of the United Nations. Mr. President, as the Secretary General said just a couple of weeks ago during his briefing in this room on the priorities for 2024, the United Nations must restore its raison d'être, which is none other than the pursuit of peace. We agree with that. We need to take bold steps in that direction in order to give peace a chance once and for all. We need to act in accordance with the UN Charter and in line with the most basic tenets of international law. And we need to do it now, in the interest of humankind and in order to avert the further loss of human life, including a widespread famine that is already being felt on the ground, and that's been signalled by a number of experts. We must correct our current course, and we must do so now. Against this backdrop, we take this opportunity to underscore that starvation and famine must never be used as a method of war. Consequently, we need to continue pushing for peace around the world, including in the occupied Palestinian territory and very specifically in Gaza, where the civilian population has now been enduring for far too long not only an inhumane blockade but also over 75 years of Nakba and a colonial and illegal occupation, that together with continued military aggression that has now escalated to veritable carnage. An initial step towards redressing this historic injustice and towards pursuing and achieving peace would be precisely to achieve a crucial ceasefire which is fully respected, a ceasefire that will put an immediate end to the ongoing indiscriminate bombing and shelling of all civilians and civilian infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. That's being done in flagrant disregard of the provisions of IHL. And in light of those actions, it's also necessary to halt the transfer of any means to perpetuate this brutal military aggression. We are confident that this would not only create the conditions for building a lasting peace, but that it would also facilitate the work of humanitarian personnel on the ground, including the entrance of desperately needed aid, including life-saving supplies. In this vein, we also take this opportunity to call for greater support for humanitarian efforts aimed at providing assistance to the Palestinian people, including through UNRWA. That organization remains a lifeline for Palestine refugees, and it has played, particularly in these horrific months, but also historically, an indispensable humanitarian role on the ground that has been recognized time and time again by this very General Assembly. Deliberately depriving the body, UNRWA that is, of funds will only further imperil the lives of Palestine refugees and of displaced civilians in desperate need. They need all the support and help they can get. Such rash actions by donor countries violate, furthermore, commitments undertaken in this field. Furthermore, in light of reports recently published by some NGOs and by other relevant stakeholders on the ground, reports which regard Israel blocking aid into Gaza, in light of those reports, we renew our call for all efforts to be taken to guarantee unimpeded humanitarian access consistently, safely, and to scale. That in order to meet the urgent needs on the ground. This is key, needless to say, in order to avoid the total collapse of critical civilian infrastructure. Such a collapse would inevitably lead to more civilian casualties, widespread hunger, more disease, more poverty, and even greater human suffering and despair. Ultimately, that would only deepen the already catastrophic humanitarian crisis and situation in Gaza. Half of the Gazan population comprises children and Palestine refugees, and 85% of the people there have now been internally displaced. We underscore the fact that Israel, as the occupying power, must fully respect and abide by the provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice on the 26th of January 2024, in other words, over a month ago. This has been a month in which, regretfully, we have seen no change whatsoever in Israel's conduct. Rather, we've seen a pattern of continued and systematic worsening of the situation. Neither over the last month have we seen a reduction in the number of casualties or attacks against civilians. Neither have we seen an increase in access of humanitarian aid. Far less have we seen charges brought against public officials who incite to the commission of acts foreseen in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Quite on the contrary. In this context, we stress the importance of avoiding selectivity or double standards in the application of international law and of other legally binding obligations, because doing otherwise would simply further embolden the aggressor to commit other crimes or to escalate violence, and it would encourage them to commit mass violations of human rights. In this regard, we emphasize that it is our collective responsibility to prevent the further prolongation of the prevailing cycle of impunity. Similarly, we also call for the adoption of urgent measures aimed at assuring the safety and well-being of all civilians on the one hand, aimed on the other hand at facilitating the provision of international protection for the Palestinian civilian population in the OPT, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, including on the basis of relevant General Assembly and Security Council resolutions. Now, looking ahead and with the intention of ensuring that a political horizon remains in place in order to fulfill the legitimate national aspirations of the Palestinian people, we express our full support for any initiative aimed at, inter alia, addressing the question of the membership of the State of Palestine at the United Nations. We want to see the State of Palestine finally be admitted as a full member state of our organization. We trust that the Security Council will shoulder its responsibility, at least in this regard, should it be serious about its commitment to the two-state solution and to the implementation of its over 90 resolutions on this matter. Mr. President, the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter reaffirms its firm commitment to the just cause of Palestine. We also reiterate our unwavering solidarity with the heroic Palestinian people in their ongoing struggle to achieve their inalienable rights, including their right to self-determination, independence, and freedom. We further reaffirm our full and continued support for all efforts aimed at ending the grave injustice inflicted upon the noble Palestinian people since the 1948 Nakba. We also remain staunchly committed to strengthening our efforts, including through our active engagement in all international initiatives aimed at ending the illegal Israeli occupation and at achieving the independence of the State of Palestine, with East Jerusalem as its capital and within pre-1967 borders. To conclude, we reaffirm our full commitment to preserving, promoting, and defending the prevalence and validity of the United Nations Charter. At the same time, we stress once again that a just, lasting, and comprehensive solution to the question of Palestine in all its aspects, including for the plight of the Palestine refugees and their right to return, is needed. This in accordance with international law, the relevant UN resolutions, and the founding charter of our organization. It can only be achieved through peaceful means, and therefore we call for urgent efforts to be made to address the root causes of this protracted and tragic conflict, which has at its core years of occupation and its subsequent consequences, and in order to ensure accountability. Mr. President, briefly, and now in our national capacity, we simply wish to make two comments. First of all, it is patently clear that the Israeli regime no longer in any way heeds Washington's calls. They've been emboldened as never before, owing to the framework of impunity which has for years been facilitated to them by their most faithful power. Now they insist on their efforts to intend to deceive us. They insinuate that unequivocal action by the Security Council could supposedly torpedo efforts underway bilaterally to achieve a ceasefire. We therefore insist that it is patently clear that the Israeli regime has no intentions of putting an end to the genocide underway. That is demonstrated inter alia by their refusal to once again allow its most faithful ally, who for years has provided it with the resources and means needed to wage its aggression against the Palestinian people. They refuse to allow them to provide humanitarian aid to save lives in Gaza. This confirms, among many other things, the cynical complicity of the United States in this genocide, which is today being committed in total impunity before the eyes of the whole international community, including in episodes such as that seen on the 29th of February, when a few days ago more than 100 people were brutally murdered while they were waiting for food in Gaza. Secondly, the time has come for this General Assembly to once again assume its responsibilities in terms of peace and international security. It must adopt a resolution which authorizes the necessary deployment of an international protection force with a mandate to guarantee the protection and right to life of the Palestinian people. Today, they are being exterminated from the face of the earth. That has been reaffirmed by senior figures in the Israeli regime itself. They've affirmed that that's the attempt being made. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela concludes by calling upon the government of the U.S. to put an end to their excuses and to turning a blind eye. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Pakistan, speaking on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, to take the podium.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have the honor to present this statement on behalf of the members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in my capacity as the acting chair of the group. Mr. President, let me express our appreciation to you for convening this meeting of the Assembly on the current situation in Palestine, with particular reference to the Gaza Strip. This meeting is taking place owing to the unfortunate event of the use of the veto on 25 February 2024 by the United States of America, being a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, during the Council's debate held under the agenda item, the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. It is deeply regrettable that the Security Council has failed, once again, to assume its primary responsibility under the United Nations Charter to halt the atrocities perpetrated against the Palestinian people in Gaza by the Israeli occupying power. This failure has no doubt reflected negatively on the primary role of the Security Council, the principal organ of the UN with regard to maintenance of international peace and security. It is obvious that since the launch of the aggression on Gaza and elsewhere in Palestine nearly the past 5 months ago, the entire world has continued to follow with growing despair and anger the monumental and unending suffering imposed on the Palestinian people in Gaza. This situation has resulted in the colossal loss of lives and wanton destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, and religious sites in Gaza due to the incessant attacks by the Israeli occupying power on the territory. The number of human casualties from the Israeli aggression on Gaza has grown further due to the recent bombardment of the city of Deir al-Balah in Gaza. According to the OIC's Observatory on Israeli Crimes and Violations against Palestinians, a total number of 690 deaths were recorded during the week from 20 to the 26th of February 2024, while over 1,057 persons sustained several injuries. It is on record that since the beginning of the aggression on Gaza on 7 October 2023, the total number of persons killed or massacred rose to 29,700. 70% of them were women and children. More than 12,500 were children. Mr. President, I would like to add that we strongly condemn the carnage wreaked by Israel's occupation forces on unarmed Palestinians awaiting life-saving aid and food delivery in Gaza on 29 February. This is another manifestation of Israel's pervasive and continuous violations of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, it is rather unfortunate, to say the least, that the various efforts deployed by the international community to end this catastrophic humanitarian disaster in the Gaza Strip have not yet yielded positive results. It is in this context that we welcome your timely initiatives to resume the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly, which led to the adoption of the two resolutions of 26 October and 10 December 2023, respectively. These resolutions, among other provisions, called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire while demanding that all parties comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, notably with regard to the protection of civilians. In the same vein, we had occasion to commend the historical initiative of the United Nations Secretary General when he invoked the provisions of Article 99 of the United Nations Charter on 6 December 2023 by drawing the attention of the Security Council to the urgent need for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. This singular action was indeed a declaration of the dangers posed by the continued war in Gaza to the maintenance of international peace and security. Mr. President, the foregoing calls for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza were not limited to the forums of the United Nations. We had cause to recall before this Assembly the resolution of the Joint Arab-Islamic Extraordinary Summit on Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people, held in Riyadh, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, on 11 November 2023. This called for an urgent and concerted global action to resolve the lingering question of Palestine, and in this regard the summit called for, and I quote, the breaking of the siege of Gaza, the cessation of armed aggression by Israel, the condemnation of attacks and targeting of civilians, the attacks, demolition and destruction of hospitals, religious and cultural sites, as they constitute acts of impunity and violation of international law, among other war crimes and atrocities, unquote. Mr. President, notwithstanding the foregoing efforts by the various actors within the United Nations, as well as by members of the international community, there are ominous signs of even greater danger ahead. In view of UNRWA's report on the impact of Israel's recent calls to dismantle UNRWA and for donors to freeze their funding to the agency, there is an imminent threat of mass starvation in the Gaza Strip due to the inadequate food supplies and essential services for the teeming number of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. Accordingly, the current United Nations General Assembly session should take concrete measures to ensure the realization of the objectives and purposes of the United Nations. There is indeed a golden opportunity for the General Assembly to give expression to the dominant views of its member states and the world public opinion at large on the need for decisive action to halt the bloodshed and carnage to which Gaza is being subjected. In this regard, we commend the position adopted by the Joint Arab-Islamic Summit for the consideration of this meeting. The member states of the United Nations should exert diplomatic, political, and legal pressure on the Israeli occupation authorities to stop its crimes against humanity and to deter further aggression. Additionally, in order to give effect to the relevant UN resolutions on the restoration of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination within a two-state solution, we call for the convening of an international peace conference on Palestine to be convened on the basis of the agreed principles under international law. In conclusion, Mr. President, the international community should uphold its responsibility in halting the Israeli aggression on Gaza immediately. The world should support the Palestinian people to achieve their right to self-determination and establish their sovereign and independent state on their territory occupied since 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, in line with the relevant UN resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta, speaking on behalf of the E10 group.
President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 10 elected members of the Security Council, the E10, namely Algeria, Ecuador, Guyana, Japan, Mozambique, Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, Switzerland, and my own country, Malta. I begin by extending our thanks and appreciation to Algeria for their constructive approach as pen holders and for their constant engagement with all Council members during the negotiations. The result was a carefully crafted text addressing the situation on the ground in a comprehensive manner, and all E10 countries voted in favor. Among other things, the draft that was tabled called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, the full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access into and throughout the Gaza Strip, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and full compliance with international law. Furthermore, it deplored all acts of terrorism and all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. It rejected the forced displacement of the Palestinian civilian population, including women and children. We therefore deeply regret that the text was vetoed. As elected members, we firmly believe that the Council has the duty and responsibility to act decisively when faced with such situations. President, the E10 remains gravely concerned about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, where the entire population is facing food insecurity. 600,000 people are on the brink of famine. UNRWA has a central role in ensuring an effective humanitarian response, and its staff has continued to play that role even under life-threatening conditions. The civilian population is facing extreme and unbearable hardships, which will only continue to grow because of ongoing hostilities. Women and children are suffering in a disproportionate manner. Social services have collapsed. Furthermore, we are alarmed at Israel's intention to launch a ground offensive into Rafah, which will further compound this untenable crisis. The consequences for civilians would be devastating. Ensuring the full and urgent implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2712 and 2720 is now more pressing than ever. Additionally, the order on provisional measures issued by the ICJ on 26 January must be fully respected and complied with. We emphasize the fact that the protection of civilians is of paramount importance. All parties must comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. All allegations of violations must be effectively investigated with independence and impartiality. In closing, President, the E10 countries reiterate their unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution, where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace, with secure and recognized borders, consistent with international law and relevant UN resolutions. An immediate humanitarian ceasefire must be the first step in this direction. Thank you. I will now make a statement in my national capacity. Excellencies, Malta regrets the circumstances that demand the convening of this debate. Malta voted in favor of the Algerian draft Security Council resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We thank Algeria for their approach as pens and for their efforts to generate agreement on a much-needed text. Malta has repeatedly and unequivocally condemned the Hamas terror attack of 7 October and subsequent rocket fire into Israel. We reiterate that the immediate and unconditional release of hostages must be a top priority. And may I remind that the UN Security Council has already passed 2 resolutions calling for the release of hostages, therefore claims that the Security Council is not acting on their behalf are inaccurate. However, the scale of human suffering that continues to unfold in Gaza leads to only one conclusion. The Security Council must call for an end to this conflict. Regrettably, so far it has not been able to do so. As a consequence, we have witnessed increasingly horrific scenes of human tragedy, such as recently in southwest of Gaza City, where more than 100 people have been reportedly killed and injured while seeking life-saving aid. We unequivocally reiterate our call for a permanent ceasefire. This is essential to alleviate the suffering of civilians in Gaza, de-escalate broader regional tensions, and provide the framework for the necessary humanitarian aid which can be provided to civilians in Gaza. As we hold this debate, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza continues to unfold. 30,000 Palestinians have been killed. Too many are suffering from catastrophic hunger and the outbreak of disease. International humanitarian law and the laws of war must be respected by all parties. Military action during hostilities must always be in line with the principles of distinction, proportionality, and necessity. Parties are also obliged to ensure that civilians and civilian infrastructure are protected. Unhindered humanitarian aid and the safety of UN and humanitarian workers must be guaranteed. The full implementation of Security Council resolutions 2712 and 2720 remains ever more pressing. President, at a time when Israel must facilitate the unimpeded delivery of humanitarian assistance and food aid into Gaza, we remain deeply concerned about the prospect that the Israeli military may extend its campaign into Rafah. The consequences of such a decision would be catastrophic. The area, designated as a safe zone, is sheltering half the population of the Strip, including over 600,000 children and their families. We also call for the immediate implementation of the order of provisional measures issued by the ICJ on 26 January. In conclusion, Malta reiterates its commitment to the realization of a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as the future capital of two states, living side by side in peace and security, in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malta. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia on behalf of CANS.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, I'm delivering this statement on behalf of Canada, New Zealand, and my own country, Australia. Thank you for convening this meeting. As CAN's countries have often affirmed, we see the veto initiative as a key plank in Security Council transparency and accountability. We thank the United States for its explanation of the use of the veto on 20 February. CAN's countries encourage the Security Council to continue to look for a way to take further meaningful action on this important issue. President, CAN's countries are deeply concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. As members of the General Assembly know, we have unequivocally condemned the 7 October Hamas attacks that saw the killing of 1,200 Israelis. And we have called repeatedly for the immediate release of all hostages. We have also stressed that Palestinians cannot be made to pay the price of defeating Hamas. Around 1.7 million Palestinians are currently displaced and approximately 30,000 have been killed. The protection of civilians is paramount and a requirement under international humanitarian law. We reiterate our calls for safe, unimpeded and sustained humanitarian access into Gaza. We are gravely concerned by indications of a proposed ground offensive into Rafah. Such an operation would be catastrophic. It would endanger the lives of the many civilians sheltering there, and we repeat our message to Israel: do not go down this path. We expect Israel to comply with the International Court of Justice's ruling on provisional measures, including to enable the provision of basic services and humanitarian assistance. We oppose any forcible displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, the reoccupation of Gaza, and any reduction in its territory. President, CAN's countries welcome Egypt, Qatar, and the United States' efforts to mediate a pause in hostilities. We urge both parties to reach an agreement urgently. As you know, Cannes countries have called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We see this as a critical step towards a permanent and sustainable ceasefire. But such a ceasefire cannot be one-sided. Hamas must release all hostages, lay down its arms, and stop using Palestinians as human shields. President, ultimately, a negotiated political solution is needed to achieve a better future for both Israelis and Palestinians. Cannes countries support Palestinian aspirations for self-determination and remain steadfast in our commitment to a two-state solution in which Palestinians and Israelis can live side by side in peace, security and dignity. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Australia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, my delegation thanks you for convening today's plenary meeting following the veto cast by a permanent member of the Security Council during its meeting on 20th February 2024 under the agenda item, the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We align ourselves with the statement of the OIC delivered earlier by the permanent representative of Pakistan. Mr. President, Malaysia profoundly regrets the exercise of the veto, which had prevented the Security Council from adopting a crucial draft resolution presented by Algeria. The text, among others, demanded an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, rejected the forced displacement of Palestinian civilians, and called for full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. Support towards the text by 13 members of the Council clearly showed that there was agreement among a large majority of the Council. Alas, this clarion call by the majority of the members of the Council, as well as the General Assembly, did not come to pass. The Security Council bears the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. The ruthless war waged in Gaza for 150 days now has beyond doubt proven to be a grave threat to international peace and security. However, the Council's continued paralysis prevents it from discharging its mandate and allowed the carnage and collective punishment of Palestinian civilians, women and children alike, to persist. The death toll in Gaza is beyond appalling. Women, children, humanitarian and health workers, journalists and media personnel, and UN staff have all fallen victim to the barbarism of Israel. The humanitarian condition has long been described as dire, as aid supplies continue to be denied or severely impeded. Bombardments persist incessantly in all parts of the Gaza Strip. For months, we have heard repeatedly from UN staff and international aid workers that nowhere is safe in Gaza. Last Thursday, we witnessed the killing of more than 100 innocent, hungry civilians waiting for long overdue food aid delivery. How many more innocent people must die before those who oppose a ceasefire in Gaza would finally see that enough is enough? Israel has brazenly violated every facet of international law with utter impunity, especially international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Israel disregards its duty to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Security Council resolutions and the order of provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice are blatantly cast aside. Israel continues to trample the rule of law, confident that it will not be held to account for its belligerence so long as it enjoys the patronage of a permanent member of the Security Council. The impunity enjoyed by Israel challenges the legitimacy of international law. It undermines efforts towards a peaceful, just, and lasting solution to the conflict, and further derails the realization of the two-state solution. Mr. President, it is time for the aggressor to be compelled to abide by the rule of law, First, states should immediately halt the sale and supply of arms and ammunition to Israel. Second, financial support for Israel to continue this horrific aggression must be terminated now. Third, punitive measures such as sanctions, visa denials, and travel restrictions should be imposed on members of the settler communities to hold them accountable for their illegal actions and reprehensible violence. Malaysia categorically rejects and condemns plans to resettle Palestinians out of Gaza, proposed by some Israeli ministers and lawmakers, as well as the recent decision of the Israeli Knesset to deny the Palestinian people their inalienable right to self-determination. Forced displacement is a clear violation of international law. These resettlement measures, which are akin to ethnic cleansing, must not be allowed to occur. We join other member states in calling on the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility in maintaining international peace and security. The Council must act swiftly, responsibly, and decisively to stop Israel's unlawful collective punishment of Palestinians. We firmly believe that bilateral or regional diplomatic efforts complement actions of the Council and reject the argument that Council action will undermine such efforts. We reaffirm our utmost support towards the full membership of Palestine to the United Nations. It is high time that we realize this long overdue recognition. Mr. President, a humanitarian ceasefire was needed months ago. Thousands of lives could have been saved had a permanent member of the Security Council not defied the call of the overwhelming majority and provided Israel the cover to persist with its mass atrocities, collectively punishing the entire Gazan population. Opposing such a ceasefire simply means one thing: complicity in the ongoing genocide against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, the veto and its undemocratic nature runs against the very principles that the United Nations was built upon. It has no place in a modern and democratic multilateral architecture. Malaysia maintains its position that the exercise of the veto by permanent members of the Security Council should be regulated to deter it from being used unjustifiably or abused. Its application must be prohibited in situations involving mass atrocity crimes, such as genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. We are also of the view that to be effective and more accountable, the veto should be exercised by at least 2 of the 5 permanent members and supported by 3 non-permanent members of the Council. This decision must then be supported by the General Assembly with a simple majority vote. Malaysia will continue to work constructively with other member states through the intergovernmental negotiations on the Security Council reform towards improving the United Nations to make it more efficient, open, transparent, and inclusive. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of United Kingdom.
President, civilian suffering in Gaza cannot continue. Hunger has reached devastating levels. Disease is on the rise. People are crammed into ever smaller slivers of land with nowhere left to go. Last week, the UK and Jordan airdropped 4 tons of life-saving aid to the Tal al-Hawa hospital in northern Gaza. We also announced an additional $5.4 million in aid to ensure UNFPA can continue to provide life-saving support to more than 100,000 vulnerable women and girls in Gaza. As my Prime Minister has told Prime Minister Netanyahu and regional leaders, we are deeply concerned about the prospect of a military offensive in Rafah. Over half of Gaza's population are sheltering in the area, and the Rafah crossing is vital to ensure aid can reach the people who so desperately need it. The deaths of people in Gaza waiting for an aid convoy last week were horrific. There must be an urgent investigation and accountability. This must not happen again. And we cannot separate what happened from the inadequate aid supplies. In February, only half the number of trucks crossed into Gaza that crossed in January. This is simply unconscionable. President, Israel has an obligation to ensure that significantly more humanitarian aid reaches the people of Gaza. We have identified a series of bottlenecks that need addressing. Israel must urgently open more crossings into Gaza, eliminate bureaucratic obstacles, enable aid operations in Gaza, and ensure there is a robust deconfliction mechanism in place to protect ordinary Palestinians, NGOs, medical staff, and others providing aid. This latest tragedy serves only to underscore the importance of securing an immediate end in fighting, leading to a permanent and sustainable ceasefire. The negotiations led by Egypt, Qatar, and the US are the only way to get life-saving aid in at the scale needed and to free the hostages currently held by Hamas. Such a deal would offer the basis from which to achieve a sustainable ceasefire and lasting peace. The elements essential to achieving this are, first, the release of all hostages. Second, the formation of a new Palestinian government for the West Bank and Gaza, accompanied by an international support package. Third, removing Hamas' capability to launch attacks against Israel. Fourth, Hamas no longer being in charge of Gaza. Fifth, and finally, a political horizon which provides a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution, with a clear commitment to grant Palestine recognition, including at the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Mr. President, Excellencies, my dear colleagues, Belgium fully supports the statement of the European Union, and I wish to take this opportunity to highlight the following points. Since the horrific attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October and the military escalation which occurred as a result, more than 30,000 people have lost their lives in Gaza. There is untold suffering being endured by the civilian populations in Gaza. More than 70% of the Gazan population has been displaced, frequently, numerously. Civil order has broken down. The health system has collapsed. Starvation looms. homes, basic infrastructure has been destroyed. 1 million children are confronted with daily tragedies and trauma. Not to forget the plight of the Israeli hostages who were torn from their families and detained since the 7th of October in the middle of the battlefield. Humanitarian relief efforts themselves have hit a dead end. Presently, the escalation of violence has threatened Rafah, where more than 1 million people are displaced. We deplore the inability of the Security Council to adopt a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire. At all times, under all circumstances, and in any conflict, be it Gaza, be it Ukraine, or anywhere else in the world, Belgium upholds the very same principles, namely respect for the provisions of the UN Charter and respect for international humanitarian law by all parties. The same applies to the Fourth Geneva Convention, which protects civilians. Belgium, Mr. President, and my dear colleagues, is particularly concerned by the plight of children who have been killed, wounded, separated from their parents. The horrors of war will have years-long psychological consequences for them. There's a need to end all forms of violations of their rights. The kidnapped children need to be freed immediately and unconditionally. All parties need to work towards that end without further delay to ensure the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2712. Belgium very strongly condemned the acts of sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas terrorists, and my country called for full light to be shed on these crimes. Today, independent experts from the United Nations have also raised serious violations of human rights violations that the Palestinian women and girls have appeared to have been victimized by in the Gaza Strip and in West Bank. Violence perpetrated against women and girls, including sexual violence, is unacceptable everywhere, at all times. In light of repeated violations of international law, Belgium calls for accountability. We call for the perpetrators of the gravest crimes to be prosecuted by competent national jurisdictions or, where necessary, by the International Criminal Court. In this vein, Belgium applauds the recent clarifications delivered by Prosecutor Khan vis-à-vis the initiatives that could be undertaken by his office. In light of the humanitarian emergency, Belgium calls for an immediate ceasefire, respected by all parties, specifically facilitating implementation and enforcement of Resolution 2720. We call for the immediate unconditional release of all hostages. We call for the enforcement of the International Court of Justice's provisional measures, including those related to the adoption without delay by the State of Israel of effective measures to ensure the delivery on an urgent basis of all basic services and humanitarian assistance to the people in Gaza. There is an imperative need to provide for unfettered, consistent humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip, as well as to provide conditions for humanitarian actors to be able to deliver assistance on the ground. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, to conclude, I would note that the fight against Hamas, against Islamic Jihad, and against other terrorist and violent extremist groups will be all the more effective if it goes hand in hand with a political horizon that offers security guarantees to Israel while at the same time addressing the legitimate aspirations to self-determination for the Palestinian people. These objectives are not mutually exclusive. Quite the contrary. For this reason, we support a political two-state solution. We support the calls of the Secretary General to establish an irreversible, concrete framework to that end. And we fully support the organization of a preparatory conference for peace as proposed by the European Union, together with the effort for peace, which was initiated by the European Union, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. The restoration of a political horizon through a political two-state solution is the only way to guarantee lasting peace and to counter extremism. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belgium. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this important veto initiative meeting. Ireland deeply regrets this veto the fifth veto since October the 7th, and a long list of vetoes on the Palestinian question since 1946. Mr. President, this war must end. There is no room for ambiguity about the urgency of a ceasefire in Gaza. The unconditional and immediate release of hostages held by Hamas is an imperative. Nor is there any room for ambiguity about the necessity of unhindered humanitarian access. For months now, these have been Ireland's demands. It is a sobering reality that a humanitarian catastrophe of massive proportions is unfolding in Gaza. A man-made conflict-induced famine now looms larger on the horizon with every passing day. A military escalation in Rafah, where almost 1.5 million desperate people are taking shelter, casts a dark shadow. This escalation would have devastating consequences. It can and must be avoided. An immediate ceasefire and unhindered humanitarian access is a human imperative. Mr. President, the Charter confers primary responsibility for international peace and security on the Security Council. At a time when the Council is so often paralysed by politics, paralysed by the use or threat of the veto, paralysed by an inability to move with the times and reform, it is incumbent on us here in the General Assembly to remember that the Charter does not confer on the Security Council exclusive responsibility for peace and security. The Secretary-General has a significant role. We saw that when he invoked Article 99 of the Charter to sound the alarm about this brutal war. It is here in the General Assembly where the true weight of global opinion can be expressed. It has an important and complementary role. Last December, this Assembly voted to demand an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. For 153 member states, the vast majority, there was no equivocation. An immediate ceasefire was our clear demand. When the General Assembly last renewed the vital mandate of UNRWA in December 2022, 157 member states voted in favour, affirming the necessity of the continuation of UNRWA's work. In our view, UNRWA remains today as essential as ever, the backbone of a life-saving humanitarian response in Gaza and a pillar of regional stability. Mr. President, wars have rules. In this conflict, Ireland's assessment is that these rules have been broken. The attacks launched by Hamas against Israel on 7th of October were reprehensible. However, international law limits the use of force in self-defense to no more than what is necessary and proportionate. Our view for some time now is that these limits have been exceeded by Israel. International humanitarian law requires respect for the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. We once again underline our serious concern that Israel's use of heavy munitions with a wide blast area is indiscriminate. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas has a devastating impact on civilians. The damage to and destruction of critical civilian infrastructure, energy, food, water, and sanitation systems further aggravates civilian suffering. Ireland is also increasingly concerned by Israel's failure to ensure essential supplies for Gaza's civilian population and to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance. This appears to us to be in violation of international humanitarian law. It is vital that the international community ensures accountability, whether at the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, or elsewhere. Sanctions against Hamas are an appropriate response to their crimes, and so too are sanctions against violent settlers in the West Bank. Mr. President, the current cataclysm in Gaza is but the latest corrosive cycle of violence in this conflict. History is replete with so many chapters on the Palestinian question and the Middle East peace process. No matter how far away peace feels right now, we, the international community, must more than ever redouble our efforts to finally write a new chapter. A political settlement in this long conflict must finally be secured. A ceasefire is urgent right now, but a ceasefire alone is not sufficient to end decades of conflict. We cannot lose sight of the bigger picture, the enduring need for a comprehensive political track leading to a Palestinian state. We await the finalization of the Arab peace plan and urge all states to unite around a common vision. Palestinian self-determination, along with peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians, can wait no longer. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ireland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Mr. President, as far as India is concerned, we have been deeply troubled by the conflict in Gaza that has been raging for nearly 5 months now. The humanitarian crisis has deepened, and the region and beyond have seen rising instability. India's position on the conflict has been clear and has been stated on several occasions by our leadership. There are 4 key points here. 1, the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas has led to a large-scale loss of civilian lives, especially women and children. As I've mentioned before, this has also resulted in an alarming humanitarian crisis. This is simply unacceptable. We have strongly condemned the deaths of civilians in the conflict. It is critical to prevent a further escalation of violence and hostilities. It is also imperative to avoid the loss of civilian lives in any conflict situation. International law and international humanitarian law must be respected under all circumstances. 2, we are cognizant of the fact that the immediate trigger of the conflict were the terror attacks in Israel on 7th October, which were shocking and deserve our unequivocal condemnation. India has a long-standing and uncompromising position against terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. There can be no justification for terrorism and hostage-taking. As such, we demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. 3, it is imperative that humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza be scaled up immediately in order to avert a further deterioration in the situation. We urge all parties to come together in this endeavor. We welcome the efforts of the UN and the international community in this regard. India has provided humanitarian aid to the people of Palestine and will continue to do so. 4, as my leadership has repeatedly emphasized, only a 2-state solution achieved through direct and meaningful negotiations between both sides on final status issues will deliver an enduring peace. India is committed to support a 2-state solution where the Palestinian people are able to live freely in an independent country within secure borders with due regard to the security needs of Israel. In closing, Mr. President, and in order to arrive at a lasting solution, we urge for an immediate de-escalation and eschewing of violence, the release of all hostages, avoiding provocative and escalatory actions, and to work towards creating conditions for an early resumption of direct peace negotiations. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Singapore.
Mr. President, we thank you for convening this debate on the use of the veto under plenary agenda item 63. We regret very much that we are meeting for the second time this year under this agenda item to discuss yet another veto cast by a permanent member of the Security Council. Singapore aligns with the statement earlier delivered by Liechtenstein on behalf of a group, and we would like to make the following additional points in our national capacity. We are disappointed that the Security Council was again unable to reach agreement on an urgently needed response to the conflict in Gaza. The Council's inability to find a diplomatic solution may mean even more dire consequences for the population of Gaza, over 30,000 of whom have reportedly been killed. We have condemned the horrific acts of terror of Hamas on the 7th of October 2023. We have demanded and continue to demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Meanwhile, the human costs of the Gaza crisis continue to escalate, and tensions elsewhere in the Middle East are growing. This could become a wider regional conflict. The Security Council, which has been charged with the responsibility of maintaining peace and security, must not remain paralyzed by inaction in the face of this grave crisis. We are particularly concerned that the veto was used to block a draft resolution demanding an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law, and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. These are all actions that the General Assembly has supported with an overwhelming majority, as reflected in the 153 yes votes for the resolution entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations, adopted here in the General Assembly at its special session on the 12th of December 2023. We are therefore glad that the veto initiative provides this important opportunity to hear directly from the Security Council members on how the Council envisages achieving these humanitarian goals. We thank Algeria, the proponent of the draft resolution, for its tireless efforts in seeking a solution to the crisis and in presenting a draft that sought to garner the widest possible consensus. We also take this opportunity to commend the vital assistance being provided by many United Nations agencies under extremely difficult circumstances. We too, as Singapore, have provided humanitarian assistance to the affected population in Gaza. Mr. President, the catastrophic situation in Gaza demands urgent action. We therefore reiterate the urgent call of Resolution 1022 for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, and we urge all member states and all permanent members of the Security Council to avoid politicizing this tragedy. We also call on Israeli and Palestinian leaders to take the initiative and embark on the difficult but necessary steps to end the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A negotiated two-state solution, in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions, is the only viable basis for a durable, just, and comprehensive solution that will allow both Palestinians and Israelis to live in the peace, security, and dignity that they both deserve. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Singapore. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, a few days ago, the international community once again witnessed another unjustifiable and cruel use of veto power by US during the voting on a draft resolution presented by Algeria, calling an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Despite receiving widespread support from member states and nations globally, the US shamefully wielded its veto power against the resolution. The action of the US administration in this regard will undoubtedly be scrutinized by both nations and history alike. Iran commends the valuable effort and unwavering dedication of Algeria within the Security Council, particularly in addressing the ongoing situation in Gaza. We commend their initiative in presenting a robust draft resolution aimed at achieving a long-awaited ceasefire. We express our gratitude to the 13 Council members who supported the ceasefire in Gaza by voting in favor of the draft resolution. The gravity of the situation in Gaza has garnered widespread attention within the international community. The Israeli authorities are using starvation as a deliberate method of war against civilian population in Gaza. Regrettably, the Council's silence has become a license to kill and starve the Palestinian population. Moreover, the international community is deeply alarmed by Israeli decision to invade Rafah, foreseeing dire consequences for the densely populated region. Additionally, the Israeli regime action in Lebanon and Syria, which contravene international law and the United Nations Charter, have further exacerbated tension and raised concerns about destabilization in the region. We strongly condemn the most recent brutal attack of the Israeli forces against the Palestinian civilians seeking humanitarian aid. The deliberate fire attack by Israeli forces has resulted in at least 117 killed and about 750 wounded civilians. All this cruelty has been happening in the absence of a demand ceasefire. We shall precisely address the obstacle that the world has witnessed and the prevented attempts by the Security Council to shoulder its responsibilities and call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in the occupied Palestinian territory. It is regrettable that the United States had decided to turn a blind eye to realities and vehemently support the ongoing genocide by Israel. It even ignores loud calls from its own nation. A self-immolation incident happened in Washington last week by a 25-year-old U.S. active duty airman Aaron Bushnell indicate that how the conscience of the people of the world has been deeply wounded by the amount of the violence against Palestinians, and how the American people are desperately ashamed of policies of their administration. The obstruction by the United States of the Council Charter duties starkly contrasts with the global appeal for an end to the bloodshed, defies the inherent human nature to preserve life and violate fundamental principles of international law, including humanitarian and human rights law. Even inadmissible justification presented by the U.S. authorities for harboring such wrongdoing act in the guise of the self-defense, regardless of their legitimacy, exempts Israel for adhering to the most basic value of humanity, the principles of international law and the compelling rules of international law that protect women, children, and unarmed civilians during war. The guarantees the Israeli war machine impunity to continue this assault on Palestinian civilians. We once again reiterate our call for an urgent and sustainable ceasefire, which in its absence, the tragedy worsens and could lead to the loss of innocent lives, including children and women. The paramount imperative is to swiftly implement the ceasefire to prevent widespread starvation in Gaza. We must reiterate the urgency of implementation of obligation under international humanitarian law and the provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice on 26 January 2024. These measures are imperative to ensuring humanitarian aid reach the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza Strip. In conclusion, Mr. President, considering the Security Council current impasse, I wish to emphasize the obligation of the third parties under international law as well as outline its provisional measure of the ICJ. All member states are not only required to refrain from recognizing or assisting the Israeli regime in its pursuit of the genocide, but also obligated to take the required steps to prevent such war crimes and acts of genocide. Therefore, we urge the international community and all sovereign states to implement necessary measures to compel Israel to cease its genocidal war and aggression against the Palestinian people. These measures may include the imposition of collective and individual economic sanctions. Furthermore, the international community must pressure the Israeli regime into halting its violation and upholding its international obligation. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, we convene today here at the General Assembly, the Parliament of the world that expresses the will of all member states and free peoples of the world. We convene after the use of veto against a draft resolution submitted by my country to the Security Council. The draft resolution that we have submitted based on the instructions of the highest authorities in Algeria in consultation and coordination with the Arab group in New York was clear in its demand and its intention, in line with the call of millions of people around the world. Immediate ceasefire in Gaza, a demand that is of extreme importance and should be heeded so that the Security Council can also adopt it in order to preserve the credibility of the UN and preserve the humanity of this world, a humanity that is diminishing with every day of hunger in Gaza, is diminishing with every tear of a mother who cries over her dead infant, diminishes with the pain of every father over the killing of his child in Gaza. Mr. President, we tried during the negotiation process to take into consideration the proposals by the different countries until we get to a text that was supposed to garner the support of all member states. However, unfortunately, it was not possible to do that because of the use of the veto right. The demand to stop hostilities in Gaza Strip and to prevent that from happening is unjustified. And the massacre in Al-Rashid Street is only an example of what happens when we fail to stop. And the continuation of the hostilities against Palestinians have paralyzed also the international community from providing aid in a timely fashion. The amount of aid has also been reduced by half this month. which shows the limited impact of both Security Council Resolution 2712 and 2720, and shows that the Secretary General was right when he announced, and I quote, "A ceasefire for humanitarian reasons is the only means to start fulfilling the needs, the urgent needs of the population in Gaza." End of quote. It is not possible that the Security Council is the only body that hasn't called for a ceasefire. The Security Council has to impose a ceasefire without any delay, or otherwise there will be nothing in Gaza that is worthy of living. For 5 months, people are being killed in Gaza Strip because it's maybe uglier in the eyes of the occupation. It is being bombarded collectively. As a collective punishment of Palestinians, the situation will deteriorate further, surely, once the ground operation is launched in Rafah. Therefore, we warn against these plans and reiterate the need to stop them and prevent them. The situation in Gaza is unbearable, and the situation of the Palestinian people are given the option of either dying by lethal weapons that countries need to stop providing to Israel, or to die of starvation or disease. This requires the lifting of the siege and delivering basic humanitarian assistance to them. This catastrophic situation that we have reached today as a result of the intransigence of the Israeli occupation and the preferential treatment by some in the international community, and they think that they can enjoy impunity. This requires us to stop and think seriously, because what we see today in Gaza will have its repercussions, and will start a new form of conflicts where people forget everything about their humanity and their values and ethics. We see horrific images that we thought had long disappeared from our world today. Therefore, we, the peoples of the UN, we who have pledged to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war, we need to act swiftly and impose a ceasefire out of our conviction in the basic human rights and the dignity of individuals, and the right of women, men, nations in terms of equal rights. Mr. President, we reiterate that the only solution for the Palestinian question is by empowering Palestinians to enjoy their legitimate rights, particularly the right to self-determination, the establishing of an independent Palestinian state. This is the choice that the international community agrees to and should be preserved in light of the existential threat to it by Israeli occupation forces. This cannot be possible unless there is a granting of full membership to the State of Palestine in the UN. Accordingly, we reaffirm our commitment that was expressed by the President of Algeria, Mr. Tebboune, to work with our brothers in the Arab and Muslim world and with all countries who support freedom and rights around the world to achieve this noble goal. Mr. President, in conclusion, we reaffirm that the right of Palestinians to their land will always be there, regardless of how time elapses. In Palestine, children and adults were killed, but no one forgot their land or their rights, and nobody will forget, because and these are rights that cannot be forgotten. And the brutal machine of war will only make Palestinians more determined to establish their state and hold fast of their land, the land of their ancestors. The stability of the region as a whole will not be achieved or possible until this historic injustice is lifted. And as such, we call the international community to act rapidly without any delay. And the start would be by a ceasefire in Gaza, paving the way towards the establishing of an independent Palestinian state with its capital East Jerusalem. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the distinguished representative of Algeria. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, we have witnessed 150 days of war that began with the terrorist acts of an armed group, the humanitarian disaster which affects the civilian population in Gaza following almost 5 months of conflict is reaching a point of no return, while the Security Council at the same time continues to not discharge its primary mandate. We laud the efforts of Algeria in the quest for urgent solutions to this grave situation. We praise the adoption of 2 previous resolutions as important steps forward to solve this crisis. We want to see the urgent implementation of these resolutions briefly, including the provisions calling for the extension of humanitarian aid and its scaling up. We support the senior humanitarian coordinator, protection of civilians and humanitarian workers, and we warn against the forced displacement of the peoples. All of this is done in the previous resolutions adoptions. However, we note that we continue to lack what is really necessary, a council resolution which calls for the immediate cessation of hostilities against civilians, and one which guarantees safe, unhindered access of humanitarian aid, which at this time is arriving via drip feed to a civilian population which suffers and will continue to suffer, and that is in spite of the call of 153 states, that is more than 80% of the membership of this organization. As such, Costa Rica reiterates its vehement appeal for the members of the Security Council to refrain from using the veto in cases of grave humanitarian situations, because not only do their actions worsen the crisis, but further undermine the credibility of the Security Council, and they undermine its capacity to solve other conflicts, both present and future ones. The exercise of the veto paralyzes the United Nations as a guarantor of peace and security and undermines the credibility of the Council and of this organization as a whole. This is the spirit of the 34 members of CELAC. That's how we see things. In the Kingstown Declaration of the 1st of March, that was adopted by the 8th Summit of Heads of State and Governments. That declaration issues an urgent appeal to all members to commit to the quest to maintain international peace and security, as well as the purpose and principles of the United Nations Charter and international law. We must see a ceasefire protecting civilians to avoid further losses of human life, to avoid conflict spreading in the region, and most importantly of all, we must have a political horizon and a plan for peace and reconstruction for the day after the guns fall silent. Costa Rica reiterates the fact that only a 2-state solution can meet the needs for security of Israel and of the Palestinian people. It's the only solution that can meet the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people for a state. That involves the creation of a Palestinian state which lives side by side Israel in peace and security. Mr. President, the failures of the Security Council are a source of disruption to peace and foster sustained humanitarian crises which protract armed conflicts. They also increase both the suffering of humans and increase the loss of human lives in conflict areas. Moreover, we're seeing displaced persons who need shelter, food, medical assistance, and psychological. What we're seeing is the damage of civilian infrastructure and damage to the environments, which is difficult to restore. With each veto, we see a reduction of the possibilities to achieve peace through political and diplomatic efforts. In sum, we are creating a crisis of trust and credibility in the institution and global governance system as a whole. In an era of crisis, only absolute faithfulness to the values and principles of the UN Charter when it comes to and international law and international humanitarian law, as well as human rights, can ensure that the best days of this organization are yet to come, and they're not simply consigned to the history books. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Costa Rica. We have heard the last speaker in this debate for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers tomorrow at 10 a.m. in this hall after the consideration of the item announced in the United Nations Journal. As announced in the letter from the President dated 28 February, there will be an informal meeting of the plenary this afternoon at 3 p.m. in this hall to hear a briefing on the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA. The General Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 63. The meeting is adjourned. Okay.
Good morning. The 9,561st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute on behalf of the Council to Her Excellency Ms. Caroline Rodriguez Baguette, Permanent Representative of Guyana, for her service as President of the Council for the month of February. And I'm sure I can speak for all members of the Council in expressing deep appreciation to Ambassador Rodriguez Baguette and her team for the great diplomatic skill with which they conducted the Council's business last month. The provisional agenda for this meeting is International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals. The agenda is adopted. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. The Council has before it the text of a statement by the President on behalf of the Council on the subject of today's meeting. I thank the Council members for their valuable contribution to this statement. In accordance with the understanding reached among the members of the Council, I shall take it that members of the Security Council agree to the statement, which will be issued as a document of the Security Council under the symbol S-PRST-2024-1. If there is no other member state wish to take floor, the meeting is adjourned. The 9,562nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with the Rules 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Islamic Republic of Iran, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Turkey to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Adediji Ebo, Director and Deputy to the High Representative, United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, to participate in the meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2024/0 111, letter dated 29 January 2024 from the Secretary General addressed to the President of the Security Council, and S/2024/192, letter dated 26 February 2024 from the Secretary General addressed to the President of the Security Council. I now give the floor to Mr. Adedeji Ebo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I thank Council members for the opportunity to brief you once again on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2118 of 2013 on the elimination of the chemical weapons program of the Syrian Arab Republic. I am providing this briefing on behalf of the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, who is currently away from office. Since the last consideration of this matter by the Council, and consistent with established practice, the Office for Disarmament Affairs has been in regular contact with its counterparts in the OPCW Technical Secretariat on activities related to Resolution 2118. Mr. President, since the Council's previous meeting on this matter, the OPCW Declaration Assessment Team, or DAT, has continued its efforts to clarify all outstanding issues regarding the initial declaration and subsequent declarations submitted by the Syrian Arab Republic. As was reported at the last briefing to the Council on this matter, consultations between the DAT and the Syrian National Authority resumed in October 2023 after a gap of more than 2.5 years. I am pleased to further report that another round of consultations have taken place from 23rd January to 1st February 2024, which is the 26th round of consultations. I have been informed that during the 26th round of consultations, the DAT conducted technical meetings, revisited the status of outstanding issues, discussed ways to resolve these issues, and interviewed 7 persons who were involved in the Syrian chemical weapons program. The DAT also discussed the results of analysis of samples it collected between 2019 and 2023, with a focus on the unexpected presence of indicators of potentially undeclared activities involving research and development, production, storage, and/or the weaponization of unknown quantities of chemical weapons. Throughout the technical meetings, the DAT requested and explained to the Syrian National Authority the need for tangible, scientifically plausible, and verifiable explanations, amendments, and documents to resolve issues. I have been informed that the Syrian National Authority provided several amendments and explanations regarding research activities at some sites, taking into consideration the DAT's proposals and requests. In addition, following the consultations, on 15 February 2024, the Syrian Arab Republic submitted 2 note verbals regarding 3 outstanding issues and new explanations of the results of the analysis of samples collected by the DAT at one of the declared sites. I have been informed that the DAT is currently analyzing the information received and will report the results in due course. I encourage all parties involved to continue this renewed spirit of cooperation so that all outstanding issues regarding the initial and subsequent declarations submitted by the Syrian Arab Republic can be resolved. Mr. President, these outstanding issues include the complete declaration of activities at the Scientific Studies and Research Center, or SSRC, and the declaration of quantities of nerve agents produced at one chemical weapons production facility that was declared by the Syrian Arab Republic as never having been used to produce chemical weapons. With regard to inspections of the Barza and Jamraya facilities of the SSRC, I have been advised that the OPCW Technical Secretariat is planning the next round of inspections in 2024. However, as of the date of this month's report, the Syrian Arab Republic has yet to provide sufficient technical information or explanations that would enable the OPCW Technical Secretariat to close the issue related to the detection of a Schedule II chemical at the Barza facilities of the SSRC in November 2018. In addition, the OPCW Technical Secretariat has advised that it will continue its engagement with the Syrian National Authority concerning the origin and usage of a chemical of dual-use nature observed by the inspection team during the previous round of inspections in September 2022. The OPCW Technical Secretariat has also requested information regarding the unauthorized movement of the two cylinders related to the chemical weapon incident that took place in Douma on 7 April 2018, which were allegedly destroyed in an attack on a chemical weapons production facility. I have been informed that, as of the date of this report, the Technical Secretariat has not received a response to this request. Mr. President, the OPCW Technical Secretariat remains fully committed to implementing its mandate aimed at verifying the fulfillment of the Syrian Arab Republic's declaration obligations under the Convention, decisions by the OPCW policy organs, and Security Council resolutions. However, as has been previously emphasized, full cooperation by the Syrian Arab Republic with the OPCW Technical Secretariat is essential to closing all outstanding issues. Considering the identified gaps, inconsistencies, and discrepancies that remain unresolved, at this time, the OPCW Technical Secretariat assesses that the declaration submitted by the Syrian Arab Republic still cannot be considered accurate and complete in accordance with the Chemical Weapons Convention. I call upon the Syrian Arab Republic to continue its cooperation with the OPCW Technical Secretariat and respond with urgency to all of the Technical Secretariat's requests. Mr. President, since the last meeting of the Council, the OPCW Technical Fact-Finding Mission, FFM, and the Investigation and Identification Team, IIT, have both released reports under their respective mandates. On 22nd February 2024, the OPCW Technical Secretariat issued a report of the fact-finding mission regarding an incident of alleged use of toxic chemicals as a weapon in Al-Yarmouk on 22nd October 2017. The report concluded that the information obtained and analyzed in line with the FFM's mandate was not sufficient to provide reasonable grounds for the FFM to determine that toxic chemicals were used as a weapon in the reported incident. The FFM is currently preparing upcoming deployments and will report to the Executive Council on the results of its work in due course. The OPCW Technical Secretariat also issued a report on 22nd February 2024 entitled Fourth Report by the OPCW Investigation and Identification Team pursuant to paragraph 10 of decision CSS4/December 3, addressing the threat from chemical weapons use, Maria, Syrian Arab Republic, 1st September 2015. In this report, the IIT concluded, on the basis of all information obtained and its analysis, that there are reasonable grounds to believe that on 1st September 2015, during sustained attacks aimed at capturing the town of Maria, units of the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, otherwise known as ISIL, deployed sulfur mustard using one or more artillery guns. The IIT was able to identify a number of 4 individuals as perpetrators, and 2 further ISIL members were identified as the primary drivers of ISIL's chemical weapons program. The Secretary General has shared the IIT report with Council members as document S/2024/200. The IIT will continue its investigations and will issue further reports in due course. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, as the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs has emphasized on many occasions, any use of chemical weapons is unacceptable. I also echo the Secretary General's call to end impunity for all those who dare to use such weapons, especially against civilians. The absence of accountability for the use of chemical weapons continues to be a threat to international peace and security and a danger to us all. In closing, I urge the members of this Council to unite on this issue and show leadership in demonstrating that impunity in the use of chemical weapons will not be tolerated. The United Nations will continue to support all efforts to uphold the norm against chemical weapons and to relegate these dreadful weapons to history. The UN Office for Disarmament Affairs stands ready to provide whatever support and assistance it can. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Mr. Ebo for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Russia, like a number of other colleagues on the Council, has repeatedly said that considering the subject of the Syrian chemical file once every 3 months is more than enough. On this subject, for a long time, we have not seen any developments of the situation on the ground. That is also confirmed by today's briefing by the Deputy High Representative on Disarmament, Adedeji Ebo. And today, on the agenda, we have the latest copy-paste monthly report of the OPCW General Director, Fernando Arias. Of the notable substantive changes, it reflects only the fact that the 26th round of consultations were held between the Syrian authorities and the OPCW Declaration Assessment Team. Moreover, on the 27th of February, the OPCW Technical Secretariat notified the Syrian authorities that 3 outstanding issues under Syria's initial declaration had been resolved. Damascus is providing all of the necessary assistance to the inspections carried out by the organization's representatives. Constructive cooperation is continuing. We feel that our Syrian colleagues will probably tell us about that today themselves. However, we have no doubt that these objective facts will do nothing to alter the tone of today's statements from Western delegations, who request these meetings with a single aim: to trot out their standard anti-Syrian arguments. The OPCW Technical Secretariat, upon the orders of the West, continues to rubber stamp politically biased pseudo-analyses. A clear evidence of that is the publication last week of the report of the fact-finding mission into the incident in Yarmouk camp in the suburbs of Damascus on the 27th of October 2017, and also the report of the so-called investigation and identification team into the incident in Morea on the 1st of September 2015. Both documents were not just another clear confirmation of the bias of the leadership of the OPCW Technical Secretariat, but also, once again, very clearly demonstrated the ineffectiveness of its work. As regards the FFM report, the facts and the timeline of events speak for themselves. The mission's representatives arrived at the scene of the incident in Yarmouk for the first time in December 2017, and the samples taken during subsequent FFM visits to that area were given to the OPCW laboratory only in January 2020. The results of the analysis of those samples by designated laboratories were received by the Technical Secretariat in 2021, but the FFM final report only reached CWC states parties 3 years later in February 2024. And that's even though, according to the provisions of the CWC, the final report into the investigation of cases of the supposed use of chemical weapons, including the results of samples analysis, is supposed to be presented to states parties to the convention no later than 30 days after the conclusion of work on the ground. We regret that we're forced to remind the OPCW Technical Secretariat the fundamental principles of its actions. As regards the report of the illegitimate IIT, we do not intend to go into the details of that. Conclusions as to the responsibility of ISIL for the incident in Morea were no surprise to anyone. The UN OPCW Joint Investigative Mechanism into incidences of the use of chemical weapons in Syria that investigated similar incidents in that area back in 2016 came to the same conclusion, that it was an act of chemical terrorism carried out on the 21st of August 2015. During preparations of the IIT document, it once again demonstrated unacceptable working methods that run counter to the CWC's principles for the investigation of cases of the supposed use of chemical weapons, the procedures for preserving evidence, working with witnesses, and ensuring that the place of incidents are visited, and so on. This has long since ceased causing us any surprise. Western countries who forced through the creation of the IIT in violation of the fundamental principles of the CWC clearly had no interest in an objective, impartial, and good quality work being done by this entity. The only aim of its work was at any cost to blame Syria for episodes of the use of chemical weapons in the absence of any convincing evidence whatsoever. In that context, we would like to repeat the principal position of the Russian Federation. We believe that this team is illegitimate. We do not believe that this team is legitimate. For that reason, we fundamentally have no intention to cooperate with the IIT nor take its findings into account. The Syrian leadership also bears no such obligations. As regards the use of chemical weapons by terrorists, let's not forget a simple fact. The Western Troika back in 2016 blocked all attempts by Russia and China to expand the mandate of the UN OPCW joint mechanism to ISIL-controlled areas of Iraq, where, according to UNITAD reports, chemical weapons were being produced, including mustard gas, as well as preparations being made to use them. It's clear that the job of demonizing the Syrian authorities for the USA and their allies is much more of a priority than countering the risk of weapons of mass destruction being used by terrorist groups. Mr. President, The facts that I've mentioned are far from the only examples of the skyrocketing politicization of the OPCW's work. That organization has long since been a platform for Western countries to advance their narrow mercantile interests, and its technical secretariat has become an obedient instrument to serve those interests. This high-handedness is no longer a surprise to anyone. During the previous meeting on the Syrian chemical file in December 2023, we addressed in detail the adoption during the 28th session by CWC member states in The Hague of recommendations to introduce collective measures against Damascus to prevent the supply of Syria to dual-use chemicals, equipment and technologies. This step contradicts the CWC and the UN Charter without mentioning the risks that it brings with it in terms of exacerbating an already dire humanitarian situation in Syria. However, do the USA and their allies think about this? Well, it's a rhetorical question. The rules-based order is much more important for them than international law is. We have no doubts that today's meeting will be nothing more than another reason for Western countries to engage in anti-Syrian rhetoric. Theirs is a show performed with well-rehearsed roles, and the discussion of the Syrian chemical file is reminiscent not so much of a play, really, so much as a tired soap opera whose directors are unsuccessfully trying to buoy up long-flagging public interest with absurd and unnatural plot twists. We won't be surprised if, in order to keep this soap opera on the air today, we'll hear more anti-Russian tales and absurd accusations. That's part and parcel of the genre thought up and advanced by Washington and its satellites. We don't intend to play into their hands. Against a backdrop of the work before the Security Council, we believe that meetings such as today's are an irrational use or rational waste of time and resources, particularly in light of the reluctance of our Western colleagues to discuss something that's awkward for their Middle East ally, that is to say, the subject of Israeli crimes against the civilian population of Gaza. We trust that the delegations that took over the watch in 2024 following this meeting will also draw the necessary conclusions about this. We do have work that we need to do together instead of holding pointless meetings to work through the playbook of a small group of countries. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me first of all to congratulate Guyana on the excellent work accomplished during the month of February and to assure you, Mr. President, and your team of our full support for your presidency. I would like to thank the Deputy High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Adedeche Ebo, for his presentation. For over a decade, obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention have been repeatedly violated in Syria. A year after the OPCW published a report on the deadly attack 2018, deadly April 2018 attack in Douma, further damning facts are brought to the attention of this Council. The OPCW Investigation and Identification Team's fourth report, published on February 22, concludes that there are reasonable grounds to believe that Daesh units used mustard gas in a series of attacks to capture the northern town of Morea on the morning of September 1st, 2015. This chemical weapon, whose use is prescribed by international law, inflicts severe chemical burns to eyes, skin, and mucous membranes. At least 11 people are said to have suffered such symptoms in these attacks, orchestrated according to the OPCW report by Daesh's highest level of command. Switzerland has full confidence in the OPCW. It welcomes the meticulous work, professionalism, and integrity of the IIT. Establishing the facts is crucial to ensuring accountability and preventing future attacks. In this case, the fact that a non-state actor has been designated by the OPCW underlines the need for member states of the CWC to take action against the transfer of chemical weapons goods to illegal recipients. Switzerland supported a decision to this effect at the last OPCW Conference of States Parties in November 2023. We also welcome the recent 26th round of consultations between the OPCW's Declaration Assessment Team and the Syrian government. We call on Syria to continue its cooperation with the OPCW. The provision of conclusive answers to the points that remain unresolved in relation to Syria's initial declaration is one of the conditions for it to regain its rights and privileges as a state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention. Providing these answers on the basis of verifiable, tangible, and scientifically plausible explanations also constitutes an obligation to this Council. Mr. President, Switzerland condemns the use of chemical weapons and calls on all parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. Adopted 12 years ago, Resolution 2118 reflects the firm conviction of the Security Council and the international community that those responsible for the use of chemical weapons in Syria must be held accountable. In this respect, we welcome the formal cooperation between the OPCW and the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism for Syria. The fight against impunity must contribute to ensuring that chemical weapons are never used again by anyone at any time and in any circumstances in Syria or elsewhere in the world. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Director Ebo, for your comprehensive briefing this morning. President, as we heard from Director Ebo this morning, the OPCW's Investigation and Identification Team released its fourth report on the 22nd of February. This latest report attributed responsibility to Daesh for a sulfur mustard attack in Maria on the 1st of September 2015. We commend the continued professionalism and expertise of the IIT, and we condemn this confirmed use of chemical weapons in Syria by Daesh. The UN OPCW Joint Investigative Mechanism and the OPCW have now confirmed 9 uses of chemical weapons by the Assad regime and 4 by Daesh. Any use of chemical weapons by anyone, anywhere, at any time is unacceptable. And we regret that we cannot exclude the possibility of the further use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime or by non-state actors in Syria. President, Syria continues to fail to fulfill its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention and under this Council's Resolution 2118. As we have said many times in this chamber, the outstanding issues with Syria's initial chemical weapons declaration that Director Ebo covered this morning are not academic. They include the fate of several hundred tons of chemical warfare agents and thousands of chemical munitions. Instability in the region increases the risk of proliferation of chemical weapons to non-state actors. We need to remain focused on the risk that non-state actors develop, acquire, or use chemical weapons. All states should meet their obligations under Resolution 1540 to ensure that appropriate mechanisms are in place to counter the spread of weapons of mass destruction, as well as their means of delivery. President, Syria's obstructive behavior and failure to declare in full its chemical weapons stockpile gives no grounds for confidence in Syria's handling of the chemicals and precursors that we know it retains. At the Chemical Weapons Convention Conference of State Parties in November 2023, state parties adopted a decision on addressing the threat from chemical weapons use and the threat of future use. Despite the spin that our Russian colleagues attempt to put on this decision, its function was very clear. It recommends that states parties review and enhance domestic measures on the transfer of toxic, dual-use chemicals and materials to Syria. And secondly, it calls on states parties to strengthen cooperation at the OPCW on tackling the threat of chemical weapons use by non-state actors. President, in the week in which Russia has called a Security Council meeting on the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia that took place 25 years ago, it's rich that our Russian colleagues say that these meetings are pointless. Because until Syria cooperates constructively and transparently with the OPCW, until Syria grants unfettered access to the OPCW Declaration Assessment Team, And until Syria fully declares and destroys its chemical weapons, this Council must remain focused on this clear and ongoing threat to international peace and security. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I too thank Director Ebo for his informative briefing. At the outset, I congratulate you, President, on assuming the presidency of the Council. You can count on our full support during this time. We also thank Guyana for steering the work of the Council in a very effective and smooth manner in the month of February. President, Malta continues to support the holding of regular meetings on this file as mandated by Resolution 2118. This resolution, adopted unanimously, established that those responsible for the use of chemical weapons must be held accountable. This is not only a question of justice, but also one of prevention. Effective accountability is necessary to make sure that chemical weapons will never be used again. The use of chemical weapons is unacceptable and completely contrary to the legal norms and standards of the international community. In view of the recent issuance of the fourth IIT report on the use of chemical weapons in Syria, while expressing our continuous support for the IIT's key role in identifying perpetrators, it is crucial for the international community to reiterate its condemnation of chemical weapons use and to ensure that adequate measures are taken. We take note of the holding of the 26th round of consultations between the DAT and the Syrian national authorities last month. While this is a positive step, it is not enough to meet the obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention and Resolution 2118. In this regard, we look forward to the outcome of these engagements, including the assessment by the Secretariat of the responses of the Syrian Arab Republic regarding the samples collected by the DAT during its deployment in the country. The latest OPCW report clearly states that the declaration submitted by the Syrian Arab Republic still cannot be considered accurate and complete in accordance with the Convention and with Resolution 2111. This is regrettable. We urge the Syrian authorities to provide explanations and documents to resolve outstanding issues, including scientifically plausible and verifiable explanations regarding research and development at certain sites. The Syrian Arab Republic has used chemical weapons against its population at least 9 times, as demonstrated by independent OPCW and joint UN OPCW investigations. Yet, over 10 years after its accession to the Convention and the passing of Resolution 2118, it has failed to declare and destroy all its stockpiles. This is deeply troubling. Malta also condemns Daesh's reprehensible deployment of sulfur mustard during its siege to capture Maria in September 2015. This development of this unlawful chemical warfare agent and the delivery system by a terrorist group is concerning. In closing, President, we reiterate our strong condemnation for the use of chemical weapons by any actor under any circumstances. Furthermore, we reaffirm our full support for the OPCW and its technical teams. They carry out their mandate independently and impartially and in accordance with international standards. The Council should be united in recognizing this and refrain from casting any doubt on their work. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I wish to start by congratulating Japan on assuming the Council's presidency this month. I thank Guyana for steering the Council to a successful conclusion last month. China's position on chemical weapons-related issues is consistent. We sternly object to the use of chemical weapons by anyone under any circumstances for any purpose. We hope our world will soon become a chemical weapons-free world. I'd like to share two observations on the Syrian chemical weapons issue. First, dialogue and negotiation. This provides the only solution to this issue. We welcome the 2 recent rounds of technical consultations between the Syrian government and the OPCW and the positive progress achieved on outstanding issues related to the initial declaration. We look forward to continuous constructive cooperation between the Technical Secretariat and the government on the basis of mutual respect and cooperation on an equal footing to create conditions for the settlement of the Syrian chemical weapons issue. Second, upholding the authority of the Chemical Weapons Convention. This is a fundamental guarantee for the settlement of this issue. It is imperative that the OPCW strictly comply with the requirements of the CWC and its verification annex, adhere to the principles of procedural compliance, reliable evidence, and credible conclusions in investigating and pursuing accountability for the alleged use of chemical weapons. A scant few countries without prior consultations, forced through a vote on and adoption of a new decision on the Syrian chemical weapons issue at the most recent Conference of the States Parties to the CWC. China finds this deeply concerning. We call on all parties to return to the tradition of consensus building to genuinely maintain the authority and effectiveness of the Convention. We also hope that the Director General and the Technical Secretariat can make tangible efforts to preserve the technical nature of the organization. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Korea also joins in commending the successful role as presidency by Guyana, and would like to express our full support and cooperation for the success of the presidency by Japan. I would also like to thank Mr. Adeji Ebo, Director and Deputy to the High Representative, for his very informative briefing on this issue. Mr. President, this Council has given its priority in realizing a world free of chemical weapons, and the Republic of Korea strongly supports the continuous efforts of the OPCW to achieve that end. In this regard, the Republic of Korea welcomes the publication of the fourth report by the Investigation and Identification Team, IIT, of the OPCW, and commends its impartial and independent work. The Republic of Korea expressed grave concern over its findings that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the Daesh deployed a sulfur mustard, a chemical weapon, in artillery attacks against the town of Maria on September 1st, 2015. Against another case of possible use of chemical weapons in Syria, we reiterate our position that all those responsible for the use of chemical weapons must be held accountable. Mr. President, more than a decade has passed since Resolution 2118 was adopted unanimously in the wake of the use of chemical weapons in Ghouta, Syria. However, we are deeply concerned that the issue has shown limited advancement over the past years. Although we welcome the recent 26th round of consultations between DAT, Declaration Assessment Team, and Syria, these consultations must move beyond mere routine meetings and yield tangible outcomes. For this, Syria must take full responsibility and provide the OPCW with scientifically plausible and verifiable explanation. 2 weeks ago, we received the latest report of the Director General of the OPCW on the progress in the elimination of chemical weapons in Syria, with explanation and amendments of the Syrian government on this issue. However, it is regrettable that there remains inconsistencies and discrepancies that needs to be addressed. Thus, we call on Syria to fully cooperate with the OPCW and to provide all the requested and the necessary information to the Secretariat. Mr. President, the use of chemical weapons can never be tolerated anywhere, at any time, and under any circumstances. In this light, the Security Council must act resolutely against any further use of chemical weapons by ensuring the full implementation of relevant Security Council resolutions, which include the complete destruction of chemical weapons in Syria. In this regard, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its steadfast commitment to holding the obligations under the Security Council resolutions as well as CWC and stand ready to work with all Council members to address the Syrian issues. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. I'd like to begin by congratulating Guyana for excellently guiding our work in February. And I wish you and your delegation every success, and we assure you of our support as you carry out the work this month. My delegation is grateful for the briefing provided by Mr. Adedeji Ebo, Director and Deputy High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. Ecuador recognizes the efforts of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and we welcome the completion of the 26th round of consultations between the OPCW Technical Secretariat Declaration Assessment Team and the Syrian National Authorities held on from the 23rd of January to the 1st of February 2024. This type of cooperation is the best way to achieve positive results, ensure accountability, and proper compliance with obligations under international law and relevant Security Council resolutions in the Syrian Arab Republic chemical weapons file. For that reason, I encourage Syrian authorities to continue to cooperate openly and transparently within a common understanding and through dialogue. Mr. President, we are concerned by the conclusions of the OPCW-ITT fourth report, which determined that there are sufficient grounds to believe that the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant used mustard agents during the attacks to capture the city of Maré on the 1st of September 2015. This is a reprehensible act, and there should be no impunity for those responsible. Moreover, acts of terrorism in all their forms, together with the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, are threats to international peace and security. Pursuant to Resolution 1540, adopted in 2004, states must adopt and apply necessary measures to keep non-state